Welcome to Mormon Land, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com, where you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, please follow us on Instagram at Mormon.land. Now for today's show. Tithing has long been seen by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a test, a trial, if you will, of faith. Well, now the practice of donating a tenth of one's income is essentially on trial in the courts. 9 plaintiffs are suing the global church, accusing Latter-day Saint leaders of soliciting and amassing these donations by the billions to support the faith's religious and charitable purposes, and instead spending money on commercial ventures, including the construction and development of a mall in downtown Salt Lake City. Last week, in a key hearing, a federal judge heard arguments in the lawsuit, which, if it is allowed to move forward as a class action, could end up involving thousands, even millions of plaintiffs and exposing hidden financial dealings within the church. Lawyers for the faith say the suit unconstitutionally violates religious freedom and should be tossed out. Attorneys for the other side counter that their case is about deception and fraud, not faith. Here to help us sort through the various arguments, how the judge received them, and what comes next is Tribune reporter Tony Semerad, who has covered this lawsuit and similar ones for several years, along with other aspects of the church's vast economic empire. Tony, welcome back to Mormon Land.
Hey, thanks so much.
Okay, Tony, in a nutshell, what was the purpose of this federal court hearing?
Okay, so this bubbled up originally as 5 lawsuits filed in a variety of states across the country. A federal panel kind of grouped them all together, put them in Robert Shelby's court in U.S. District Court in Salt Lake last May. So not too long after that, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Ensign Peak, who are the plaintiffs here, they filed a motion to dismiss, and they are seeking to dismiss the complaint that's filed by these 9 plaintiffs from 6 different states, but also the move to create a class. This is filed as a class action litigation, and so the church's lawyers are also attacking that. So this hearing last Friday was oral arguments. The two sides have been exchanging legal briefs all this whole time. This was the first oral arguments before Judge Robert Shelby on the motion to dismiss.
So Ensign Peak Advisors, to be clear, is the church's financial arm, investment arm, I guess, right?
That's correct, based in Shelby City.
So, Tony, tell us a little more about the plaintiffs and what they were seeking.
Well, this involves a current and disaffected Latter-day Saints, as I mentioned, in 6 different states. They have filed to recover their tithing, varying amounts among the plaintiffs. And they've also, they're seeking to have the judge kind of intervene to halt tithing while a special master appointed by the court can sort of sort through their finances. And again, they are claiming that they were deceived, that the church misled them by saying that their tithing would be used for charitable purposes, when instead it was deposited, according to their claims, in Ensign Peak, and earned the church unbelievable market returns.
So, Tony, tell us, you've mentioned him. Tell us about Judge Robert Shelby. Who is he,
So he currently presides over U.S. District Court in Salt Lake City. He's an Obama appointee, and most people familiar with the name would associate him with, I believe, a 2017 ruling that overturned the state's law against same-sex marriage shortly before the the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in the country. He's also dealt with some tithing litigation in the past, and so he was selected as the judge to preside over this would-be class action.
So let's get into the oral arguments. What did the church tell the judge?
Well, the church selected somebody who may be one of the foremost conservative attorneys in the country, one very familiar at the appellate level, Paul Clement. He's based in Virginia. And their argument is essentially, it's a threefold argument, but the main core of it is that to allow this lawsuit to proceed would be tantamount to a very severe invasion of the church's autonomy in a First Amendment guarantee, and that it can govern itself the way it chooses, and in kind of religious liberties, that it would essentially be a violation of the First Amendment to even sort of probe into some of the issues at stake. The plaintiffs are accusing the church of fraud under federal statute, and the church's argument is that even setting about proving the basic elements of fraud in this case would be a violation of church autonomy and religious freedom.
So you've spelled out what the plaintiffs are arguing overall. What did the plaintiffs say in these oral arguments? What are some arguments that they made specifically?
Well, that was an interesting part of the hearing. The Judge Shelby, seemed to highlight deficiencies in their filing to prove fraud. The plaintiff's attorneys basically sort of came out swinging with a reiteration of the elements of their lawsuit, that the church for over up to 20 years has solicited tithing and other donations, specifically fast offerings and other sort of charitable donations, under the premise that they invest 100% of that in charitable purposes and fulfilling the church's needs. Shortly, not long into the plaintiff's arguments along these lines, Shelby kind of started to poke holes in some of that, as he did with the church's arguments.
Do you want to say more about those holes?
Well, yeah.
Responded?
Yeah.
On the plaintiff's side, yeah.
So under federal statute, there's a very sort of specific, almost checkbox way in which you prove fraud. You point to statements that were made by the alleged fraudster. You point to the reasons why a plaintiff might have believed those statements. You point to their financial action, that they paid tithing based on those beliefs. And then you would point to ways in which those statements were a misrepresentation, and those would be the elements of fraud. Instead, you can argue that the plaintiff's complaint has taken a very general kind of approach. They've not been specific about what their donations were, whether they were tithing, whether they were fast offerings, and this sort of thing. Not been really specific as to what the plaintiffs believed at the time. There are other elements of fraud that the plaintiffs are sort of saying that their complaint is a general sort of thematic complaint, rather than parsing the specifics of why each plaintiff gave and why they felt misrepresented. And Shelby's questioning seemed to really kind of point to the fact that, at least in the sort of prescriptive way that fraud is proved in federal court, that the plaintiffs may not have filed a complete complaint. And at one point, the plaintiff's attorney, Chris Seeger, even sort of tried to leave open the door that the plaintiffs could amend their complaint to fix these deficiencies if it came to that.
So, Tony, in previous stories of yours and previous filings and in these arguments, the very notion of, quote, tithing seems to have become an issue. What did the church say about it, and how did the judge respond?
Well, so going back to those elements of fraud, the church and attorneys for Ensign Peak have argued that to sort of prove the veracity, let's say, of a church's statement that funds were used for charitable purposes, or to prove that a plaintiff believed that what the church was saying at a specific point when they gave tithing. Both of those and sort of related, proving those sort of related claims would involve parsing religious belief. What did you believe at the time? Did the church leader actually believe what they said at that time? And their argument, the church and Ensign Peak, their argument is that there's sort of a very steep, slippery slope there, that as soon as you start delving into those kinds of issues necessary to prove fraud, you're digging into religious belief and asking the courts to prove the veracity of a religious belief, which would be a clear violation of the First Amendment to put the courts in charge of deciding religious ideas.
So did anything surprise you in these oral arguments? You've heard everything, Tony. Was there anything?
Well, I was surprised at how sort of fiercely Shelby dug into the apparent insufficiencies of the plaintiff's case. It seemed to sort of point to his sense that there may be some weaknesses there. Now, on the flip side, Shelby was very specific in not accepting the idea that there was sort of a blanket protection against fraud accusations just by creating a church. He posited the scenario of the total fraudster, somebody that basically just creates a church to engage in fraud, calls any cash at hand tithing, and therefore is somehow sort of exempt in a blanket way. He didn't really seem to accept that there could be a sort of a blanket preclusion from any kind of fraud allegation just because you're a church and because it involves tithing. But he didn't tip his hand entirely in terms of how he might rule about that. But he has ruled in a prior case, in a case called Gaddy, Laura Gaddy, a North Carolina resident who, along with some other plaintiffs, is also suing the church with a kind of a similar, although not identical, kind of line of argument. Judge Shelby has ruled in that case that churches, are susceptible to fraud accusations. It's not a blanket exemption, and so that was also interesting. We got a little bit of an indication on where Shelby might come down on that.
Tony, I want to dig into that because that was a fascinating part of your story, and we talked about this at the time. There was this exchange over what you're talking about, the extent of so-called church autonomy and its protection from such lawsuits. As you said, Shelby said churches are not exempt from fraud liability simply because they're churches. But the church attorney countered that they sort of are, stating that that's the price we have to pay, he said, for freedom of religion and keeping secular courts out of faith. What was your take on that?
Well, this seems to be a very claim kind of unique to tithing itself, right? This practice that's common to other Christian faiths as well, of giving a tenth of your income to the church. Attorney Paul Clement's argument seemed to be that is essentially rooted in the idea of a commandment from God, right? That tithing, as opposed to just sort of dropping a few dollars in the collection plate, at sort of a Catholic mass, that tithing was sort of uniquely bound in the notion of faith and this idea that it would come from a commandment of God. Really, the church's argument is that fraud would really only apply in the sort of very direct cases of embezzlement, of church funds, or in situations where church leaders may have solicited funds for one purpose and then use them for an entirely different purpose. And the example of was used of raising money for, say, victims of the Los Angeles fires, and then buying the pastor a new car or new clothes with those funds, where there was clearly a disconnect between how the funds were solicited and how they were spent. But yes, indeed, tithing, at least according to the church's arguments, would be uniquely carved out, and cases involving tithing would not, according to the church's argument, be liable for fraud.
So what did the judge say to the church's practice of investing tithing donations?
There was a very interesting turning point in the hearing where the judge basically probed the plaintiffs, asked them if they had actually pointed to any false statements in their complaint. And he seemed to sort of poke them on the argument that investment is basically part of what a church would prudently do with tithing or finances like that it would be a responsible thing to do. And of course the church's attorneys have made this argument all along that really this is all one big bucket, that these funds are going in a sort of a reserve at Ensign Peak that's considered a reserve of reserves, right? That this is funds that will ultimately be spent for church purposes. They may be invested now, and they may be earning fantastic earnings right now, but ultimately that money would also be spent on the church's needs. And so, it would not in any way be a violation of considering tithing sacred.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you about next. The church has stated in some recent arguments that you've reported that amassing massive financial resources is helping it fulfill its religious missions, and pointing to its increasing charitable work, to its expedited temple building, which is ever present to members, of course, around the world. Has the church, though, ever articulated how those reserves play into that? In other words, that yes, we're tapping those reserves in order to provide charity here in Africa or wherever, or also to build the crush of temples that are being built right now?
Yeah, in their latest filing, just before the oral arguments, they kind of put these reserves in the context of these other, broader and frankly more expensive aspects of the church's mission, but not saying, oh yeah, we will use those funds for temple building and for helping members in less advantaged nations. Not that those funds would be directly used for them, but that it's part of the elements in the constellation of the church's mission, right? That we have a right to amass reserves like that for big things that might be coming. They've also called it a kind of a rainy day fund. That and that is kind of part of the whole picture of church governance, that those are issues for them to decide, not for plaintiffs to tell them, oh, you need to be spending on this or on that, that's an essential element of church governance and church autonomy that's protected by the First Amendment.
So did you ultimately get any indication of which way the judge was leaning?
Well, my conclusion is that Shelby's really quite, he's an excellent judge for this. He seemed to be deferential to both sides and wanting to hear those arguments. But I think if we got any clue as to where he might be going, it relates to this issue of constitutional avoidance, which sounds like a mouthful, but basically judges in this position, if they can decide a case like this without touching on vital constitutional issues, that is, if there's a legal premise for dismissing this case on some other basis, then the judge, under the principle of constitutional avoidance, would kind of do that. And that line of questioning I talked about before, where the judge seemed to be highlighting sort of legal deficiencies in the plaintiff's case, not in their necessarily arguments, but in the basic pieces that they needed to prove fraud. That seemed to give a little bit of a hint that Shelby could kind of avoid the whole constitutional question and just basically decided on what are called Rule 9 and Rule 12 arguments, basically having to do with the elements of fraud. So we got a little indication there, but believe me, questioning to the church's attorneys and Ensign Peak's attorneys, was just as withering. And, Shelby seemed to be very attuned to the niceties of this issue of church autonomy. And so I wouldn't read that as a 100% clue as to where he's headed, but he seemed to highlight some of the deficiencies in the plaintiff's case.
So, Tony, a couple of questions as we close. First of all, any indication on when Shelby might rule? And then I'd also like to address the two other tithing lawsuits against the church, or tithing related, that are currently on appeal before the 9th and 10th circuits.
Yeah, my hunch is that Shelby's ruling is coming in a matter of weeks as opposed to months, maybe in contrast to some of these cases at the appellate level where you've got multiple judges kind of thrashing through. We're just down to one judge. So my hunch is that his ruling on the motion to dismiss and the certification of the class is probably coming within weeks. If I had to guess, he's taken all of this under advisement, and he has been reading these briefs and studying since it landed in his court in last May. And we have sort of hanging over this case the lawsuit filed by James Huntsman, very similar to this, a prominent Utahn who is seeking his tithing back, and he's claiming he was misled in that the church said it wouldn't use tithing for certain commercial ventures, specifically City Creek, the shopping center downtown, the church-owned real estate development downtown, and an insurance company, Beneficial Life, that got into trouble. And there were funds diverted from Ensign Peak to prop up City Creek and Beneficial Life, and James Huntsman's claiming that went against the assurances of church leaders that tithing wouldn't be used for commercial ventures. That has made its way all the way up to the to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. There were arguments a couple of months ago, and we're awaiting a ruling in that. And then that case that I referred to earlier that Shelby has dealt with, the Gaddy case, that's also on appeal at the 10th Circuit right now, with some similar issues before the judges. And we're expecting rulings in both of those sometime this year.
Tony, anything else readers should be watching between now and when those rulings come, or are those really the next big things?
I think those are the next big things. It's very clear that the church is sensitive about scrutiny of its finances. It's made that very clear in a lot of the legal briefs. And, as we all do, I'll be kind of watching the church for moves on financial transparency, major charitable contributions. I think we've seen in the last couple of years some pretty big increases in how much the church is doing philanthropically worldwide. And so if I'm watching anything in addition to these rulings, it's kind of for little hints that the church's policy on financial transparency might be shifting.
Tony, one last question. If Judge Shelby allows this lawsuit to proceed as a class action, what are the stakes for that, for, say, the church?
Yeah, there are some very deep issues involved in the certification of a class here. At one point, the church's attorney feared that in arguing before Shelby, that a ruling along those lines, sort of certifying the class, could create a great schism in the church. The church has been making arguments very steadily that these are dissenters. These are people that are not currently in tune with church doctrine, and to lump faithful members into a class, which is what the plaintiffs are purporting to do, that this would be a class of all tithe-paying current and former members, that would be sort of legally flawed to lump conflicting interests of various plaintiffs together. So, but a class action along those lines, as you might imagine, could involve millions of people, and this whole idea, it kind of almost sounds outlandish under the First Amendment. This whole idea of creating freezing the church's finances and while accountants can sort through it all in creating a special master. Those are being pointed to by the church and its attorneys as some of the dire repercussions of all of this, of violating the First Amendment and letting this lawsuit sort of go there. Those were pointed to as very clear violations of the First Amendment should we ever get there.
Tony Semerad, thanks for joining us and thanks for your reporting.
Okay, thank you.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher-Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.